Big budget games are getting harder to make. Cutting edge AAA games get more expansive, more fluidly animated, and more beautiful every year. That means more assets need to be made, more detail needs to go into each piece, more polish needs to be applied. All of this needs to be done by the professional artists, animators, riggers, musicians, and programmers of the gaming industry. And they don't work for free. But even with the astronomical budgets of modern AAA games, there's an ironic twist. There are game design problems that get harder and harder to solve as a game scales up. The more work that goes into making a game, the harder it is to infuse it with meaningful narrative choice. The ability to play with narrative choice is one of the great strengths of video games as an art medium. But narrative choice needs to be thought through carefully, and all paths of that choice need to be developed. Otherwise, if you're not careful, if a game designer or scriptwriter could put narrative choice in wherever they think it's most interesting, the production process of a game can get out of hand very quickly. So what are some ways that game developers add meaningful narrative choice efficiently? Let's say we're making an RPG that follows the plot of Star Wars Episode 4. Early on, you want to let the player make a really interesting narrative choice for Luke. He could follow Ben, become a Jedi, and save the galaxy. Or he could stay as a moisture farmer on Tatooine. If you leave with Ben, your game should probably develop into a pretty standard RPG. Action sequences, dialogue options, pretty similar to Knights of the Old Republic. But if you stay, it wouldn't really make sense to have a bunch of fight scenes. Instead, the Luke as moisture farmer game might feel a bit more like a Star Wars themed Harvest Moon. A completely different experience. The setting would be unique, game mechanics would be completely different, the music would change, entirely different creatures and people would have to be modeled. If you had a big set-piece action sequence on the Galaxy Saving Branch, you'd probably want to create something equally impressive on the other side, or else the branches would feel out of balance. You'd need way more people and way more time to build out both choices. By giving the player just this one narrative choice, the studio would need to create two essentially unique games and bundle them into one disc. But this example is a bit overboard. If it were that hard to add narrative choice, we wouldn't have many games with it at all. So, how do game designers add what feels like meaningful narrative choice to their games without creating an avalanche of work? Well, for one, you can make the choices not last nearly as long. If you can make a choice but resolve that choice before too long, you can rejoin a central plot thread. For example, Night in the Woods lets you pick which friend to hang out with on several nights. Hanging out lets you get more insight on each of the characters, but the next morning will play out the same way no matter what choice you make. The choices are isolated, and this can encourage multiple playthroughs, but using this technique can cause other problems too. Shadow the Hedgehog has a bunch of splitting paths that unlock as you make choices during the earlier stages, letting you sort of plinko your way through to the end of the game. It even diagrams all the paths that you've taken, so you can see exactly where you are. Unfortunately, once you've played through the game a few times, you have to slog through big chunks of the story that you've already played to get to any new content. Also, Shadow the Hedgehog is terrible, and it's really hard to make a bad game good by having a lot of different endings. Speaking of that, another way to get the feeling of choice in a game without blowing your budget is by having multiple endings. If the ending hinges on one choice, especially near the end, you don't have to make as much content for each path. And you also avoid that replay fatigue problem if you let the player save right before they make that choice. You can also make a lot of small choices add up, instead of having a single major choice decide your ending. A lot of BioWare games took this route, with a light and dark meter in Knights of the Old Republic and the Paragon Renegade system in Mass Effect. Throughout the game, you accrue points that determine character alignment. Meet certain thresholds throughout the story, and new options open up to you, including distinct endings. Fable and Infamous did something similar too. Dishonored has a more modern take on this, There's an order and chaos meter that you affect throughout the game. The world changes as you move towards either extreme, which helps make the world feel impacted by small choices that you've made. However, these meter systems often have a problem. It's very easy to make the middle path uninteresting. If you don't act like the saintliest saint or the most devilish devil, your in-game options are limited. A lot of the most interesting powers are locked away at the extremes, and a lot of the more interesting story options are too. The middle path can result in underpowered characters, no faction to really call your own, and NPCs that criticize you for the choices you've made anyway. This makes players want to pick a side and stick with it always, which ironically makes a game full of choices feel a lot more linear. Telltale adventure games have lots of small decision points too, but they often run into a different problem. If you make a choice between option A or option B, and both have to make sense in the rest of the plot, the game shouldn't just hand-wave away the implications of one of the paths. Take Telltale's Game of Thrones. In it, you have to pick one of your advisors to become your right-hand man. Spoiler alert, the other one betrays you. For one of the advisors, the reasons for their betrayal make sense. But if you choose to promote them instead, the other side completely breaks character to betray you. Just because both of these possibilities needed to rejoin the plot at the same point. Another strategy that adds choice while keeping production costs down is to reuse as much of the game as possible, but give new context depending on the path you're taking. Tactics Ogre does an amazing job here. The game takes place on a small number of discrete maps which you travel through and fight on throughout the story. There are a few points in the main plot where you will pick a side to ally with, which completely changes which NPCs you encounter, fight for, and against. But the maps all remain the same. You might be fighting north to south for one faction, marching towards a southern port town, while if you took the other path, you'd be fighting on the same map, marching south to north, looking to besiege a northern castle. You get a completely different story and really feel like you've made a major choice without a ton of extra work for the developers. Like Tactics Ogre, Chrono Cross also reuses large parts of the game, but adds a lot of narrative choice through the interactions you have with your party members. The game lets you recruit literally dozens of unique characters, but many of them are blocked off in side quests or story options. Make a choice to save a character, and not only can they join your party, but entirely unrelated branches of the story will unlock later on, each in turn having their own characters to recruit. Make a different choice, and the game unfolds completely differently. The characters you recruit will all say the same lines in a given cutscene, but they'll say them according to their own verbal tics and mannerisms. Different events will happen in the same map location depending on which characters you've recruited before. Chrono Cross does have paper-thin characterization for most of the extended cast, especially once they join your party, but the game gives you so many options, and the same story advances in so many different ways depending on the path you take, that your choices do feel impactful. Lots of these techniques work best in relatively large games, but how do smaller indie studios with tiny staffs and shoestring budgets make games with interesting choice? Actually, that irony I talked about earlier works in their favor. The production value expectations that get baked into AAA game development make it more time-consuming to create the branching paths that come with meaningful choice. But if you don't have to make something as pretty as a AAA game, a lot of that problem goes away. Less graphical fidelity for each asset makes it easier for a small team to make more of them. It's much faster to make branching storylines for a game that looks like Final Fantasy Tactics than for a game that looks like Final Fantasy 15. Better development tools over the last 10 years have also made it easier to do more work in less time. Narrative choice is a tricky problem in game development. If you let it, it can explode the scope of a project and slow down production on even the highest budget games. Finding the right combination of meaningful choice and handling how that choice plays out over the course of a game can mean the difference between an immersive and personally meaningful experience and vaporware.